Good morning! Now I'm going to get on with the statistics for the trail. So lots of graphs. I kept a spreadsheet the whole time. I'm a spreadsheet person. I love spreadsheets and formulas and making graphs and just recording the data from the hike. So that's what you're going to see next. I kept track of all of the statistics as I was hiking through two spreadsheets. So the first spreadsheet was my hike log, and in this one every night, usually just before dinner, I would put down my mileage, and so yeah, I covered the mileage, my times, how I was camping, and any trail magic or resupplies I was doing that day. And that's what gave me the bulk of the information for these statistics. And the other spreadsheet was my expenses. So I was tracking everything that I was using money on, categorize them into the key areas, and then did the exchange rates between the US dollars and New Zealand dollars. Exchange rate was changing. Rather than do daily one, I just sort of summarized per month, so it's rough exchange rates. And that's what gave me the idea. So it was pretty easy to be recording this as I was going, and I'm glad I did because it gave me some nice information, as you're now about to see. While on the trail, the vast majority of the time was spent in my tent. There are not really huts on this trail. And cowboy camping, I only did it once in the end. I just like the protection of my tent to stop the insects, especially after the morning when I woke up with ants all over the ground, and I was nice and safe in my tent. I probably have a higher motel percentage than a lot of people. When I go into town, I don't want to pay to put my tent up. I want some comfort, and that's why that number is quite high. And I was very lucky with trail angels. I had 3 lovely trail angels who put me up, and it was for a number of nights for each of them, and so that was very well appreciated. If I had a choice, I would have stayed in hostels a bit more often, but it was very rare for the towns we went through to have hostels. For the nights that I was in my tent, as you can see, the majority of the time I was by myself. I think this is a lot higher than it would have been on a normal year, just because in the Sierras there were so few people, and that's why I was by myself so often. And even when I was with people, it was generally just small groups, one or two or three people. Very rarely did I have to share with large groups. And once again, I think that's because I started early, so I wasn't in the bubble, and didn't have to fight for space in campsites, which was quite nice. This is a summary of how I spent my time overall in each state. The original planning I did before I left, I had thought it would take 158 days to complete the hike. It took me 171, so that's 13 days difference, which is pretty good considering the delays with the snow. And I did have some enforced zeros, so that 25 days of zeros overall. That includes the 4 days in Bishop Lone Pine, where I was waiting out the storm that was roaring through the Sierras, as well as organising replacement money and passport. And I also in Chester, there were 4 days where I was sat waiting in town for my passport to arrive, only to be told the courier company had lost it. But having a look at this graph, it's a lot more even across all of the states. in terms of the split between zero, narrow, and hiking days, which surprises me. But overall, I think it was fairly balanced. I was listening to my body a lot, and I think that's why I took quite a few rest days. It's probably a higher portion than a lot of people, but I was pretty happy with it. So this graph is looking at my average distance I was doing per day. So having a look at the overall, full days only. For me, a full day was when I was doing 6 hours or more. That's what I counted as a full day only. So average 21.3 miles a day across the entire hike. So looking at that, the low was in the Sierras, where it was only 15.2 miles, which is to be expected with the snow. And then in Oregon, I ramped it up to an average of 29.5 miles a day. The blue all days excluding zeros. So this is including just the part days where I was doing less than 6 hours. So it's only days where I was actually walking. And then the yellow is basically taking it from the start overall, or the start of each state, to the end of each state, regardless of how long I was resting. So the Sierra obviously is much, much lower. But overall, averaging 15 miles a day, including zeros and narrows, pretty happy with that. I think it was a pretty good speed overall. And then looking at it in kilometres, for comparison, on Te Araroa, my distance for full days was 32 kilometres. For days without zeros was 29 kilometres, which is actually, so that's identical. And overall, including zeros, it was 27 kilometres compared to 25 for PCT. So yeah, that's interesting, the differences between the two hikes. Looking at the average daily speeds, they tell a very similar story to the average distances. But it was, Oregon's significantly more. But Washington surprised me that I was still having pretty good speeds and more, basically higher speeds than in Northern California. But that's probably due to the fact that Northern California, there was still a lot of snow. I recorded how long I was hiking each day, and as you can see, I generally put in a good day's work, more than your average 8 hours a day that you would have in a job. But as it was fun, I didn't mind hiking. Also, as I got fitter, I was able to walk longer, and also it didn't get dark till quite late going through summer, long hours of daylight. But the key thing was my fitness and the conditions, which allowed me to start walking for longer every day. And just for interest, I compared the distance I was doing each day with the time I was walking each day, just to see the correlation. And it's pretty clear here that the Sierras, I was walking longer days for less reward in terms of distance covered. But as to be expected in Oregon, while I was walking longer distances, while I was walking for a longer time each day, the distance I was covering was a much bigger increase than what it had been. The longest I walked was 17 hours and 30. That's when I did the 50-mile challenge. And the shortest I walked in a day was 35 minutes. And that was coming out of Mount Shasta in the evening, just getting away from the road. Expenses breakdown. This is one that a lot of people ask about, and it's quite important for planning purposes. So first of all, I'll just look at percentages so we don't get distracted with amounts. And these are just my on-trail expenses. It's not included my pre-trail, which was my air tickets, insurance, donation to PCTA, and a little bit of gear. I was lucky I already had majority of my gear. It was just a few replacements. So food, not surprisingly, food is the biggest expense. I actually found the food in the US a lot more expensive than I was expecting. Gear was a little higher than I expected, but I started the hike with a lot of gear that had already done the Norway Thru Hike. So I'd already done 2,000 kilometers, so I didn't expect it all to last the whole hike. And about a third of the way in, I had to replace a few things. Plus, I had to buy the snow equipment, my crampons and my ice sacks. Thankfully, I didn't need to buy a new tent like I thought I would. My little tent managed to last until the end because that would have significantly changed the gear price. Accommodation is probably a lot higher than it would be for someone a lot younger who is on a tighter budget. As I explained in the accommodation section, I was in motels a lot more often where there weren't hostels, and I just didn't want to sleep in my tent anymore. And yeah, so that's why the accommodation cost is a bit more. Communication, that is my mobile phone, though it was the AT&T plan was pretty useless in terms of reception for a lot of it, but I found that quite expensive for what I was getting out of it. And the other cost is my satellite phone, which I thought was good value for money. I think the satellite phone worked out at about $38 a month, US dollars a month. So that was actually pretty cheap. Donations, that was used if I stayed at Trail Angels houses. Trail Angels were doing food, I will offer it. Staying at places like the Lutheran Church. And if I hitched with someone and they went out of their way, then I would always offer some money as well. The other 1% is things like laundry, haircut, postage, just little expenses like that. So now what you actually really want to know is the amounts. Here it is. So firstly, in US dollars, the total amount was $9,341 US dollars on trail. And including pre and post hike expenses, that brought it up to $12,067. So looking at in New Zealand dollars, the total cost was 14,320 New Zealand dollars for on-trail expenses, and everything pre, post and on-trail 18,420 New Zealand dollars. I thought it would be interesting to have a look at their Trail Magic statistics, and Washington is the clear winner. And I think if I did this in comparison to the proportion of time spent in each state, it would exaggerate just how much more Washington had than the others. So cash, that could be a box on the side of the road. It could be a chili bin, a cooler. Sitting there with soft drinks, anything that was left behind without the Trail Angel there. Deliberate was where Trail Angels had actually gone out and set up a stand, intentionally waiting for the hikers to come through. And impromptu was just people that were walking along and saw a hiker and decided to give them something, or driving past. It's not including the occurrences where people were buying me meals in towns. This is just Trail Magic on trail. But that did happen. I had numerous occasions where wonderful, complete strangers just offered to buy me a meal. And the most memorable was this group of bikies. They were in the full bike leathers, didn't have patches. And I talked to them as they were just getting off their bikes. We went into the same restaurant, sat in separate places. But when my check came, one of them came up to me and grabbed it and said, we'd like to pay for this, please, because we think what you're doing is amazing. And so, yeah, these big, tough bikers, but just such lovely people. So you can't judge people. They're probably laughing at my pathetic efforts to bond when I talk to them about my little 400cc Japanese rice beater type motorbike. But yeah, that happened several times. I had people buy me meals. This is an area I've been asked questions about a lot, and that is my weight loss. Here's some pictures to visually show how much weight I lost. And as you can see, it was a lot. So in terms of pure weight, I started at 152 pounds and went down to 124 pounds. And here it is just in kilograms. And in chart form, which probably makes it a little easier to see, it shows that I lost 27.5 pounds, which is 18% of my body weight is what I lost. And 12.5 kilograms were lost over the hike. Now, most females especially, they tend to actually gain a little bit of weight to start with before they then start losing the weight. And that's as the muscle starts developing, that's where the weight gains, and then the fat starts melting away, and that's where the losses start. There were several females I met that didn't lose any weight at all, or actually some of them gained weight. Just depends what condition you were in at the start. I was overweight to start. I knew I was overweight. You could see it. But I actually ended up losing too much weight. By the end of it, I was too skinny. It was a couple of weeks after the Sierras when I noticed that my reserves were gone, and that meant that if my nutrition started to become important, and if I wasn't eating enough on trail, then I was losing the energy. Whereas previously, I'd had a little bit more leeway as my body fat was being consumed. And then also I took measurements of my body to just see the differences in my size and body shape. And I always find this one interesting. I did this on Te Araroa as well. So reading at the yellow line at the top, that is basically the widest part around my butt and upper hips. And yeah, significant losses in the first month, and then a little bit more steady losses for the rest of it. And then the blue is my chest, and that didn't lose a lot after that initial loss of fat. And that's because with the hiking sticks, I was actually developing my lats, so that was actually gaining muscle, and you'll see right at the very end it was increasing. So that's because I was in Washington and there were more hills, so I was using my arms more, and I think the muscle started developing again. And yeah, the red is my bust, so that pretty much melted away. Visually, It looked like it melted away, but it was the back muscles that had developed which kept the measurement more than what it visually looked like. The grey was my stomach. Yep, so exactly same trend. And then the blue and the green, that was my upper thigh, and that just continued to be losing weight throughout the whole time. That's sort of where the bulk of my fat was stored pre-hike. And yeah, it just continued to dissolve away, and that was visually, could really see my thighs getting skinnier and skinnier. Looked like my calves were almost bigger than them by the end. The next two, the dark blue and I'm not sure what colour that is, brown, reddish colour. So that is my lower thigh. So that's a measurement taken just above my knee. And yeah, that was a steady drop. I was surprised at that. I thought that that would actually increase a little bit. And you can see for that, the first few weeks it did increase slightly as I started developing my thigh muscle, but then it started dissolving away. And then the bottom two, that's my calf measurements. And it did drop a little, but it didn't drop much. I didn't have much fat in there. So yeah, in summary, looking at that, you can see that that first month was a real big drop in weight. And then going through the Sierras, it was actually fairly steady. And then it wasn't until after June that it started dropping again. So yeah, really interesting to see. Resupply is another interesting statistic. So I used a total of 30 resupplies, and as you can see, I bought local most of the time. It was only twice that I sent myself packages, and that was more because I was going on to a specific diet. I was struggling with normal food, so I decided to try some energy powders, and I was about to do my 50-mile challenge, so I wanted a lot more energy gels and energy chews. So I sent ahead to Mazama, and I'm glad I did, because Mazama had almost nothing. It was a few chocolate bars, and they did have some noodles, but that was about it. And Shelter Cove, I also sent a package to myself. They had a really good resupply options there. So if I was going to do it again, I wouldn't send anything to Shelter Cove again. But apart from that, I bought at the little shops and the little supermarkets. That was my plan. Number one, I didn't want the hassle of arranging packages and sending them and waiting for the post office or wherever they were, hoping that they wouldn't get lost. And while I knew a lot of the little places would be more expensive than buying at a big supermarket, by the time you took the postage costs into effect, there wasn't a big difference, and I liked supporting the little places along the way. Yeah, I think it was more relaxing doing it that way. So in hindsight, the only thing I would change is I wouldn't send anything to Shelter Cove, and the rest of it I would do the same. I carried more food than a lot of people. It was possible to do some shorter resupplies, but I preferred not to go into the towns when I didn't need to. And there were some times, especially leaving Mount Shasta, there was an option to cut that in half to stop at Etna, but I'd had a few quite short legs, and I just wanted a longer period of time out in the wilderness. The other thing that changes these statistics from normal was in the Sierras. Because of the snow, I was going through longer, so therefore I needed more food. And between Bishop on this, but Kearsarge Pass and Mammoth Lakes, the normal resupply places of the Muir Ranch and VVR, they were closed. So I had no choice but to have a long period, and that was 11 days food. So that affects the statistics. So yeah, on average, I was carrying 4.5 days food after each resupply. Shortest was 2 days, and that longest was the 11 days. I also get a lot of questions about shoes. So here is the information about my shoes. I started the hike, I'd already done approximately 100 miles on the shoes. So I've included that in the chart. So I used 5 pairs of shoes. The last pair of shoes still have quite a bit of life left on them. But averaged 552 miles per shoe, so 888 kilometers. I don't like using the shoes for too long because the cushioning starts to go on them. The very first pair of shoes, they were swapped out quite early because the heel started collapsing on them, which is causing me blisters. They are the shoes I bought in New Zealand. I don't know if that's relevant or just the type of hiking I was doing in New Zealand with the shoes, if that affected their lifespan. Surprisingly, the shoes that took me through the Sierras lasted the longest, probably because the snow didn't wear on the sole as much of them, though they did get some slight holes where the crampons were rubbing on them. And yeah, I swapped out the shoe number 4. I swapped them out early. They did still have life left on them. I would have got another 100 to 200 miles, but that would have meant I would have having to be trying to swap them in a stretch where the resupply wasn't so good. So I took advantage of trail days and bought some shoes at discount, and that's why they were swapped out, and I knew then that my last shoes would last me all the way through.